This music is impossible even for masters. But the homeless boy surprised everyone. The last coin fell on the dusty ground with a metallic sound that echoed through the nearly empty square. Daniel adjusted the old accordion on his lap and felt the cracked leather scratch his skin. Another day ending without managing to gather enough money even for bread. The sun was setting behind the colonial houses of Lancaster, painting everything in golden hues that couldn't hide the raw reality of his situation. It was then that he heard firm footsteps approaching. The man wore a well-tailored suit despite the heat and a Panama hat that protected his face from the setting sun. Arthur Thompson was known in town as someone who understood music, but also as a person who had no patience with amateurs. He stopped right in front of the boy and smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Boy, you've been here for weeks playing these simple tunes," said Arthur, pulling a yellowed score from his inner jacket pocket. "But I bet you've never heard of the Waltz of Lost Winds. Not even masters who have studied their whole lives can perform this piece." Daniel looked up at the man. At 12 years old, he had already learned that life wasn't generous, but he still carried that determination only children possess. His clothes were dirty and torn, his bare feet marked by the red dust of the dirt streets, but his eyes shone with an intensity that caught attention. "Can you show me the music?" asked Daniel, extending his small, calloused hand. Arthur let out a dry laugh. "Show you? Boy, this music is over 100 years old. It was composed by a German who came to America fleeing the war. They say he poured all his pain and longing into this waltz. Professional musicians try their whole lives and can't play it properly." Some people began gathering around, curious about the conversation. Mrs. Martha, who sold turnovers on the corner, approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Mr. Howard, a retiree who spent his afternoons in the square, also came to see what was happening. Daniel took the score carefully, as if it were something sacred. His eyes scanned the handwritten notes, faded with time. For a few seconds he remained silent, processing the composition's complexity. It was unlike anything he had ever played, full of subtle variations and time signature changes that required refined technique. "I can try," he said simply, adjusting the accordion on his thin arms. Arthur crossed his arms, clearly skeptical. "You can try, but don't be embarrassed when you fail. This music has separated many good men from music." What happened next would change the lives of everyone present. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath and began to play. The first chords came out hesitantly, as if the boy were testing the territory, but soon his confidence grew and the music began to flow like crystal clear water. His small hands danced across the accordion with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so young. The Waltz of Lost Winds began to fill the square with a melody that was both melancholic and hopeful. Daniel played each note with a precision that left everyone hypnotized. It was as if the music had a life of its own, telling stories of lost loves, abandoned dreams, and the beauty that still exists in the world, despite everything. Arthur felt his jaw drop. His eyes widened when he realized the boy not only knew the music, but was playing it with a perfection he had never witnessed. Every variation, every subtle change in rhythm, everything was there, executed with a mastery that should take decades to develop. The people in the square stopped what they were doing. Mrs. Martha dropped the cloth she used to wipe the table and stood still, her eyes brimming with tears. Mr. Howard took off his hat as if he were in a church. Even the children playing nearby fell silent, drawn by the music that seemed to have the power to stop time. When Daniel reached the climax of the waltz, his fingers flew across the accordion with a speed and precision that defied any logical explanation. The music rose in an emotional crescendo that made several people in the small audience wipe tears from their eyes. It was impossible not to be moved by that melody played with so much passion. The end of the waltz came softly, like a breeze that gradually fades until it disappears completely. Daniel opened his eyes and looked around, surprised by the absolute silence that had settled over the square. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, slowly, the applause began. Arthur was pale, clearly shaken by what he had just witnessed. He approached the boy with faltering steps, as if walking in a dream. "How?" was the only word he could utter. How do you know this music? Daniel lowered his eyes, suddenly shy under all the attention. I only found some old sheet music in the trash behind the music school. Every night when there's no one around, I practice. This music was there, a bit torn, but I could make out the notes. You learned it by yourself? Asked Arthur, still incredulous. Yes, sir, I don't have money to pay for lessons. I live under the school's awning, so every night I hear the students practicing. I learned by imitating the sounds they make. The revelation hit the small crowd like a bomb. Arthur looked at the boy with a mixture of admiration and shock. In his 50 years of involvement with music, first as a teacher at the local music school and then as a retiree, he had never encountered such an extraordinary natural talent. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Daniel, sir, Daniel Miller." "And where are your parents, Daniel?" The boy hesitated, nervously fidgeting with the accordion straps. "I don't have parents, sir. Or at least, I don't know where they are. I've been living alone for 2 years. Arthur's heart tightened. He looked at the boy's torn clothes, his dirty bare feet, his small but calloused hands from work and a hard life. How had someone so young and in such difficult circumstances developed such extraordinary musical ability? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The crowd began to disperse, but not without leaving some coins in Daniel's open case. Mrs. Martha approached and handed the boy a still warm turnover. "You play beautifully, my child," she said, her eyes still moist. "There's been a long time since I've heard music that touches the heart so deeply." Arthur stood there, watching Daniel eat the turnover with the hunger of someone who hadn't had a decent meal in days. An idea began to form in his mind, but he knew it wouldn't be simple to put into practice. "Daniel," he finally said, "would you like to learn more music? For real, I mean, with new sheet music, proper techniques." The boy's eyes lit up in a way that broke Arthur's heart. "You would do that for me? But I don't have money to pay." "Money isn't the problem," replied Arthur, though he knew his teacher's pension was modest. "The problem is, I live in a boarding house, and the landlady, Mrs. Beatrice, is very strict about the rules. She wouldn't allow you to live there." Daniel nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. He was used to rejections. "But that doesn't mean we can't find a way for you to learn," Arthur continued. "How about we meet here in the square every night after 10? At this hour there's no one around, and I can bring sheet music and teach you a few things." Joy returned to Daniel's face like the sun emerging after a storm. "Really? You would do that?" "Of course, my boy. Talent like yours shouldn't be wasted." That night, Arthur had trouble sleeping. He couldn't get the image of the boy playing that impossible waltz so perfectly out of his head. As a retired teacher, he had encountered some talented students over the years, but nothing compared to what he had witnessed that afternoon. He had lived in Mrs. Beatrice's boarding house for 3 years, ever since he retired, and decided he no longer wanted the hassle of maintaining a house. The room was small but comfortable, and the boarding house's central location allowed him to walk around the city easily. The landlady was a stern woman in her 60s, who maintained strict rules about visitors and noise. In the room next door lived Patricia, her 42-year-old daughter, who had returned to her mother's house after a complicated divorce. Patricia worked as an accountant at a local office, but her life had become a bitter routine of work and caring for her widowed mother. She had never remarried and seemed to have lost the ability to dream or get excited about anything. The next morning, Arthur woke up determined. He went to his old trunk and took out some sheet music he had collected over the years. Many were pieces he used to teach advanced students, others were compositions he himself had created in moments of inspiration. He carefully organized everything, thinking about how he could structure the lessons for Daniel. During the day, Arthur couldn't concentrate on anything else. He walked around the city, did his usual shopping, chatted with acquaintances, but his mind was always on the evening meeting. There was something in the way Daniel played that reminded him of his own passion for music when he was young, a passion that years of technical teaching and life's frustrations had gradually diminished. When the clock struck 10 at night, Arthur discreetly left the boarding house carrying a folder with sheet music and a small metronome. The square was deserted, illuminated only by the full moon and the old lampposts that gave the place a nostalgic air. Daniel was already there, sitting on the same bench where he played during the day with the accordion on his lap. Seeing Arthur approaching, he quickly stood up, clearly anxious. "Good evening, Professor Arthur," the boy said politely. "Good evening, Daniel. I hope you're ready to work because we have a lot to do." Daniel's eyes shone when he saw the sheet music Arthur took out of the folder. It was as if it were Christmas and his birthday at the same time. He had never had access to quality musical material, having to make do with torn and stained pages he found in the trash. "Let's start with some basic technique exercises," said Arthur, arranging the sheet music on the bench. "I know you have a natural gift, but it's important to develop a solid foundation." For the next 2 hours, Arthur worked with Daniel on various aspects of musical technique. He taught about correct posture, breathing, and especially how to interpret the nuances written in the sheet music. The boy was a sponge, absorbing every piece of information with a thirst for knowledge that moved the teacher. "Daniel, where did you learn to read sheet music?" Arthur asked during a break. "I used to watch the students in class through the school window. Then when they left, I would gather the papers they threw away and try to understand. At first it was difficult, but after a few weeks I started to relate the symbols to the sounds I heard." Arthur shook his head in admiration. "You've accomplished in a few weeks what most students take months to learn. That is truly remarkable." When they finished the first lesson, Daniel was beaming. He hugged the accordion as if it were his most precious possession and looked at Arthur with genuine gratitude. "Thank you so much, Professor. I never imagined I could learn so much in just one evening." "This is just the beginning, my boy. Tomorrow at the same time." "I'll be here," promised Daniel. Arthur returned to the boarding house with a warm heart. He had rediscovered the joy of teaching, the pleasure of sharing knowledge with someone who truly valued every lesson. He quietly entered the building, but didn't notice that Patricia was in the common kitchen drinking chamomile tea to help her sleep. She saw her father come in with the folder of sheet music and glanced at the clock on the wall. 12:15. Where could he have gone at that hour carrying musical materials? Patricia decided not to ask at that moment, but the question lingered in her mind. The nightly meetings in the square became a routine. Every night, promptly at 10 o'clock, Arthur and Daniel met for their lessons. The boy's progress was extraordinary. In just 2 weeks, he was already playing pieces that would normally take months to master. Arthur began to notice changes in himself as well. He was more cheerful, more motivated. The prospect of teaching Daniel gave new meaning to his days. He started researching more challenging scores, planning specific exercises to further develop the boy's talent. But not everything went as expected. One night, when returning from the lesson with Daniel, Arthur found Patricia waiting for him in the boarding house's living room. She was sitting in the old armchair, arms crossed, and a serious expression on her face. "Father, we need to talk," she said as soon as she saw him enter. "Of course, my daughter. What is it?" "Where have you been going every night with those sheet music? Mrs. Beatrice has already noticed that you always leave at the same time and come back after midnight." Arthur sighed. He knew that sooner or later he would have to explain the situation. He sat in the armchair next to his daughter and told her everything. The meeting with Daniel in the square, the boy's extraordinary talent, the nightly lessons. Patricia listened to everything in silence, but her expression grew increasingly worried. "Father, don't you think it's dangerous to be in the square alone with that boy late at night? What if someone sees and gets the wrong idea?" "Wrong idea about what, Patricia? I'm teaching music to a talented child." "Father, you know nothing about this boy. He could be dangerous, he could have bad intentions. Those street kids aren't trustworthy." Patricia's words cut through Arthur like blades. He looked at his daughter with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "Daniel isn't just any street kid, Patricia. He has an extraordinary musical gift that can't be wasted, and even if he were, that doesn't mean we should ignore a child who needs help." "Father, I understand you want to help, but there are proper ways to do it. Why don't you look for some institution that handles these cases? Why does it have to be you personally?" Arthur tried to explain what he felt when teaching Daniel, the joy of seeing that natural talent develop, but he could tell Patricia didn't understand. To her, it was just a retired old man putting himself at unnecessary risk. "Patricia, I'm going to keep teaching Daniel. It's the most important thing I'm doing at this stage of my life." "Then you'll have to choose," she said, rising from the armchair. "Either stop this story, or I'll have to tell Mrs. Beatrice about your nightly outings. The lady is already suspicious, and if she finds out you've been at the square with a street boy, she might even ask you to leave the boarding house." The threat hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Arthur knew that Mrs. Beatrice was truly strict about the boarding house's reputation, and that she might make a drastic decision if she thought he was causing trouble. That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the impossible situation he was in. On one side, the pressure from his daughter and the threat of losing his home. On the other, the responsibility he felt toward Daniel and his musical development. The following night, he went to the square with a heavy heart. Daniel was there, as always, with a hopeful smile and the accordion in his arms. Arthur decided he wouldn't tell the boy about the problems with Patricia, at least not yet. The lesson went on normally, but Daniel noticed something was different. Arthur seemed worried, distant. His explanations didn't have the same energy as usual. "Professor, are you all right?" asked Daniel during a break. "Yes, my boy. Just a bit tired." Daniel didn't press further but kept watching. In the following days, the tension at home increased. Patricia began making sarcastic comments about her father's nightly adventures, and Mrs. Beatrice indeed started asking questions about Arthur's schedule. The situation reached its limit when Mrs. Beatrice appeared in the common kitchen one morning and confronted Arthur directly. "Professor, I need to know what you've been doing every night. Some neighbors mentioned seeing you at the Central Square at inappropriate hours. That's not good for my boarding house's reputation." Arthur felt his blood run cold. He looked at Patricia, who averted her gaze, but he immediately knew who had told Mrs. Beatrice about his outings. "Mrs. Beatrice, I can explain—" "No need to explain anything," she interrupted. "Just stop this behavior. If it continues, I'll have to ask you to find another place to live." The threat was real and serious. Arthur knew Mrs. Beatrice wasn't bluffing. With his modest retirement, finding other decent accommodation in the city would be very difficult, if not impossible. That night, for the first time in 3 weeks, Arthur didn't show up at the square. Daniel waited until almost midnight, sitting on the bench, anxiously looking in the direction from which the professor usually came. When he finally accepted that Arthur wouldn't come, he felt a pang of abandonment he knew well. It was the same feeling he had experienced when his parents disappeared from his life without explanation. He returned to his resting spot under the music school's marquee, but couldn't sleep. He stayed awake all night, softly playing on the accordion the songs Arthur had taught him, trying to understand what he might have done wrong. The next night, Daniel returned to the square, hopeful that perhaps the professor had just had an unexpected event. But again, Arthur didn't appear. On the third day, Daniel decided to look for Arthur. He knew the professor lived in some boarding house in the city center, so he began discreetly asking around. Mrs. Martha, the turnover seller, knew everyone in town and soon gave him the information he needed. "Professor Arthur lives at Mrs. Beatrice's boarding house on Maple Street. But why are you looking for him, my son?" Daniel vaguely explained that he had something important to give to the professor, without going into details about the lessons. In the late afternoon, he headed to Maple Street, his heart pounding. The boarding house was an old but well-kept building, painted light yellow with green windows. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, nervous, trying to decide whether to knock on the door or wait to see Arthur come out. That's when he heard raised voices coming from inside the house. One of the windows was slightly open, and he could make out Arthur's voice arguing with a woman. "Father, this is ridiculous. You're going to ruin your reputation over some random boy." "Patricia, Daniel is not just any boy. He has a gift that could make him a great musician." "A gift? Father, wake up to reality. He's a beggar taking advantage of your kindness." Daniel felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. So that was it. The professor's daughter didn't want him to continue with the lessons. He was seen as an opportunist, an inconvenient beggar. "Patricia, you don't understand," as Arthur began. "I understand perfectly. And if you don't stop this madness, I'll speak to Mrs. Beatrice myself." You'll end up getting kicked out of the boarding house because of this kid." Daniel couldn't bear to hear any more. He ran away from Maple Street with teary eyes and a tight chest. Now he understood why Arthur had disappeared. He had caused problems for the professor, exactly what he hadn't wanted to happen. That night Daniel didn't go to the square, nor the next one. He decided it would be better for everyone if he simply disappeared from Arthur's life. He returned to his previous routine of playing in the square during the day to earn a few coins, but avoided any place where he might run into the professor. Arthur, for his part, was going through one of the worst weeks of his life. The pressure from Patricia and Mrs. Beatrice had made him stop the lessons with Daniel, but he couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Several times he considered going to the square to explain the situation, but the threat of losing his housing paralyzed him. During the day he walked through the city with a constant feeling of guilt. He had promised Daniel that he would help him develop his talent, and now he was breaking his word for reasons that, when deeply analyzed, seemed small and selfish. A week after stopping the lessons, Arthur decided he needed to at least talk to Daniel and explain the situation. He couldn't just disappear from the boy's life without a word. At lunchtime, he went to the square looking for the boy. When he got there, he saw Daniel sitting on his usual bench, playing for some tourists who had stopped to listen. But something was different. The boy seemed smaller, sadder. His music, although technically correct, had lost that liveliness that had so impressed Arthur the first time. Arthur approached hesitantly. When Daniel saw him, he stopped playing abruptly and lowered his eyes. "Daniel, we need to talk," said Arthur, sitting next to the boy. "You don't need to explain anything, Professor," Daniel replied softly. "I understood. I was causing problems for you." "Did you hear the argument at the boarding house?" Daniel nodded, still without raising his eyes. "I don't want you to lose your home because of me. It's better to forget about the lessons." Arthur's heart broke hearing those words spoken with such resignation by such a young child. He realized at that moment that he had failed not only as a teacher, but as a human being. He had allowed fear and social pressure to stop him from doing what he knew was right. "Daniel, forgive me," he said, putting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "I shouldn't have stopped the lessons. What you have is too precious to be wasted because of other people's prejudices." Daniel raised his eyes for the first time, and Arthur saw there a mixture of hope and distrust. "But what about your daughter? And the landlady?" Arthur took a deep breath. He had made a decision while walking to the square, a decision that could completely change his life. "I'll find a way to work this out. Maybe I'll have to look for another place to live, but I won't abandon you again." The conversation was interrupted by a woman approaching the bench where they were sitting. She was an elderly lady with white hair, looking about 70 years old, dressed in simple but clean clothes. She had overheard the conversation from a distance and decided to approach. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I didn't mean to intrude, but I couldn't help hearing part of your conversation. I'm Eleanor Roberts. I live near the square." Arthur stood up respectfully. "Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor. I'm Arthur Thompson. I know you by sight, Professor, and I've also heard this young boy play several times. He has a truly special talent." Eleanor turned to Daniel with a gentle smile. "What's your name, dear?" "Daniel, ma'am." "Daniel, I wanted to tell you something. My husband, who passed away 5 years ago, was a musician. He played guitar and accordion, and always said that music was the purest way to express the feelings of the heart. When I hear you play, it's like hearing his voice again." Daniel blushed, clearly moved by the lady's words. "Mrs. Eleanor," said Arthur, "Daniel has extraordinary talent, but we're facing some difficulties to continue the music lessons." "What kind of difficulties?" Arthur hesitated, but decided to be honest. He told her about the situation at the boarding house, about Patricia's resistance, about Mrs. Beatrice's threats. Eleanor listened to everything in silence, shaking her head at times. When Arthur finished speaking, she remained thoughtful for a few seconds. "Professor Arthur," she finally said, "I live alone in a house that's too big for me. I have 2 empty rooms since my children got married and moved to other cities. If you'd like, you can rent one of the rooms. The price would be much lower than what you must be paying at the boarding house, and I don't mind music. In fact, it would be nice to have some music in the house again." The offer came as a gift from heaven. Arthur looked at Daniel and saw hope returning to the boy's eyes. "Mrs. Eleanor, that would be wonderful, but Daniel has nowhere to live either. Would it be—" "Of course," interrupted Eleanor, as if the question were obvious. "The house has plenty of space, and I've always wanted a grandson to care for. If Daniel wants, he can stay in the other room." Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. A real house, with a room just for him, and still being able to continue learning music with Arthur. It seemed too good to be true. I don't have money to pay," he said hesitantly. "Who said anything about money?" laughed Eleanor. "You can help with the house chores, take care of the garden, and of course, play for me from time to time. I haven't heard good music at home in years." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. That afternoon, Arthur returned to the boarding house to pack his bags. Patricia was surprised by her father's sudden decision. "Dad, what is this? You're moving out just like that, out of nowhere." "It's not out of nowhere, Patricia. I found a better opportunity, a place where I can live in peace and do what I consider important." "This has to do with that boy, doesn't it?" "Yes, it does," Arthur replied firmly. "And it has to do with me, too. I discovered that I still have much to offer, much music to teach. I won't waste my last years hiding from other people's prejudices." Patricia fell silent, processing her father's words. There was something in his determination that made her reflect on her own life. When was the last time she had felt passionate about something? When had she last chased a dream or tried to help someone? "Dad, maybe I was too hard on the boy." Arthur stopped packing clothes in the suitcase and looked at his daughter. "Patricia, you're afraid of everything that represents change, new things. But sometimes you need to take some risks to find truly important things in life." "Where will you live?" "With Mrs. Eleanor Roberts, a very kind lady who lives near the square. And Daniel will live there too." Patricia felt a strange pang in her chest. It wasn't exactly jealousy, but something similar. Her father had found a new family, a new purpose, while she remained stuck in the same bitter routine. "Do you think you could introduce me to them someday?" The question surprised Arthur. He looked at his daughter and saw something different in her eyes, an openness that wasn't there before. "Of course, my daughter. I'm sure they'd be happy to meet you." The following week, Arthur and Daniel settled into Mrs. Eleanor's house. It was a simple but cozy home, with a backyard garden where Daniel could practice without bothering the neighbors. Mrs. Eleanor proved to be a perfect hostess, treating Daniel like the grandson she always wanted and respecting Arthur's space. Music lessons resumed, now with much more structure. Arthur set up a small studio in the back room, organized all the sheet music, and created a study schedule suitable for Daniel's development. The boy's progress continued to be extraordinary. He absorbed each lesson as if he were thirsty for knowledge. Arthur began introducing more complex pieces, advanced techniques, and even some fundamentals of musical composition. Mrs. Eleanor became Daniel's first official audience. Every afternoon after lunch, she would sit on the porch to listen to the boy practice. Her observations, though from a layperson, were often surprisingly perceptive and helped Daniel connect more emotionally with the music. "Daniel, when you play that sad waltz, it reminds me of the day my husband left for the war," she said one afternoon. "You managed to put into the music the same longing I felt." Comments like this made Daniel realize that music wasn't just about technique and precision, but about communicating human feelings and experiences. 1 month after the move, Arthur decided it was time to introduce Daniel to some important people in the local music community. He scheduled a meeting with Maestro Richard Anderson, who directed the small municipal orchestra and was also responsible for selecting young talents for study scholarships in the capital. Maestro Richard was a man in his 50s, with a graying mustache and a commanding presence that intimidated many young musicians. He had agreed to listen to Daniel more out of courtesy to Arthur, who was respected in the community, than out of genuine interest. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning in the hall of the old music school. Arthur arrived nervous, accompanied by Daniel, who carried his old accordion with his usual care. "Professor Arthur, it's a pleasure to see you again," said Maestro Richard, greeting him cordially. Then he looked at Daniel with a polished but clearly skeptical smile. "And this must be the young prodigy I've heard so much about." Daniel politely extended his hand. "Good morning, Maestro. Nice to meet you." "The pleasure is mine, young man. Professor Arthur told me you play the accordion and have some natural talent. Is that true?" "I try my best, sir." Maestro Richard pointed to a chair in the center of the hall. "Well, let's see what you're capable of. How about starting with something simple? Do you know any basic waltz?" Daniel looked at Arthur, who nodded encouragingly. The boy positioned himself with the accordion and, after taking a deep breath, began to play a simple waltz he had learned in his first lessons. Maestro Richard listened politely, but his expression showed he was not impressed. It was a technically correct performance, but nothing that justified Arthur's enthusiasm. "Very well," he said when Daniel finished. "You have decent technique for someone so young. With a few years of proper study, you could become a competent musician." Daniel felt the coldness of the comment and looked at Arthur with uncertainty. Arthur realized that Maestro Richard had not been impressed and decided to risk everything. "Maestro, with your permission, I would like Daniel to play a specific piece, the Waltz of Lost Winds." Maestro Richard's eyes widened. "Professor Arthur, you cannot be serious. That is one of the most difficult pieces in the accordion repertoire. Professional musicians with decades of experience avoid playing it." "I know exactly what I am asking." Maestro Richard looked at Daniel with a mix of curiosity and doubt. "Boy, do you really know this waltz?" Daniel nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. It was the first difficult piece I learned." "First difficult piece?" Maestro Richard let out a disbelieving laugh. "My dear boy, that piece is impossible for someone your age and experience, but if you want to try and embarrass yourself, feel free." The comment hit Daniel like a slap. He looked at Arthur again, who gave him an encouraging nod, and decided to accept the challenge. If he was going to be embarrassed, at least he would try his best. Daniel closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first chords of the Waltz of Lost Winds filled the hall with a melancholy beauty that made Maestro Richard straighten in his chair. As the music progressed, his features changed from skepticism to surprise, from surprise to admiration, and finally to absolute astonishment. Daniel played every note with perfect technical precision, but more than that, he infused the music with an emotional depth that was rare even among experienced musicians. It was as if he understood instinctively every nuance of the composition, every story the music wanted to tell. When he reached the most difficult passages, those that separate amateurs from true virtuosos, Daniel executed them with an ease that defied any rational explanation. His small hands flew over the accordion as if they were natural extensions of the music itself. Maestro Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. In his 30-year musical career, he had seen many talents, but nothing compared to what he was witnessing. This 12-year-old boy was not just playing a complex piece, he was revealing his soul through the music. When Daniel finished, the silence that followed was deafening. Maestro Richard stood still for long seconds, processing what he had just heard. Finally, he rose from his chair and approached the boy. "Daniel," he said, and his voice trembled slightly. How did you learn to play like that?" "Professor Arthur taught me, sir." Maestro Richard looked at Arthur with an expression of reverence. "Professor, in all these years, I have never heard anything like that. This boy is not just talented. He is a genius." Arthur felt his eyes fill with tears. Finally, someone besides him had recognized Daniel's extraordinary talent. "Maestro, I knew you would understand. Daniel needs opportunities to develop his gift. He deserves access to the best teachers, the best instruments." "Absolutely," agreed Maestro Richard, still visibly shaken by the performance. "Daniel, would you like to study music professionally? In the capital, there are schools that could help you further develop this incredible talent." Daniel's eyes lit up, but soon a shadow of concern crossed them. "I would really like that, Maestro, but I don't have the money to pay for studies like that." "Money won't be a problem," said Maestro Richard firmly. "I will personally ensure you receive a full scholarship, Talent like yours cannot be wasted due to lack of resources." Daniel looked at Arthur, who was smiling with pride. It was hard to believe his life was changing so drastically. Just a few months ago, he was just a homeless boy playing in the square to get a few coins. Now he was being offered an opportunity that could completely transform his future. "Professor Arthur," said Maestro Richard, "I would like to talk with you about the next steps. We need to organize Daniel's paperwork, prepare his transfer to the school in the capital, and most importantly, ensure he continues developing his technique before the move." The conversation went on for over an hour, with the two men discussing the practical details of this new phase in Daniel's life. The boy listened to everything with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. It was thrilling to think about the possibilities opening up before him, but also frightening to imagine leaving Arthur and Mrs. Eleanor, who had become his family. When they left the music school, Arthur and Daniel walked in silence for a few streets. Finally, the professor stopped in a small square and sat on a bench. "Daniel, are you happy about this opportunity?" he asked. "I am, Professor. Happier than I ever imagined I could be. But I'm also scared." "Scared of what?" "Of going to the capital alone, of not being able to keep up with the other students, of never seeing you and Mrs. Eleanor again." Arthur placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Daniel, you won't be alone. I will follow your progress closely, and I'm sure Mrs. Eleanor will want to know all about it too. As for not keeping up with the other students—" He laughed softly. "My dear boy, I'm more afraid you'll leave the other students behind." That afternoon, when they arrived home, Mrs. Eleanor already knew the news. Maestro Richard had called her to congratulate her for caring for such a special talent. She greeted Daniel with a tight hug and teary eyes. "My dear boy, I'm so proud of you," she said, stroking Daniel's hair. "I always knew you were special, but now the whole world will know too." "Mrs. Eleanor, I don't want to leave you alone," said Daniel, clearly emotional. "Nonsense. You won't be leaving me alone. You'll be fulfilling your dreams, and that will make me the happiest woman in the world. Besides, it won't be forever. You'll always have a home here with me." That evening, the three of them dined together in a festive yet melancholic atmosphere. It was a celebration of Daniel's success, but also an early farewell to the happy routine they had established. Arthur had prepared a surprise for Daniel. After dinner, he brought out a box wrapped in brown paper. "Daniel, this is a gift for your new journey." The boy opened the box carefully and let out a cry of surprise. Inside was a new accordion, much more sophisticated than his old instrument. It was a professional model, with additional buttons and far superior sound quality. "Professor, this must have cost a fortune. How did you manage—" "I sold my old watch, a family heirloom. But don't worry about that. That watch sat in a drawer for years without serving any purpose. Now, it has turned into something that truly has value, an instrument for your music." Daniel hugged the new accordion as if it were the most precious gift in the world. Then he hugged Arthur so tightly, the professor almost lost his balance. "Thank you so much, Professor, for everything. For believing in me when no one else did. Daniel, never forget. The talent was inside you from the beginning. I just helped you find the way to let it flourish." In the following weeks, the preparations for Daniel's move to the capital intensified. Arthur worked tirelessly to obtain all the necessary documentation, since Daniel had no official birth records or any other documents. The process was complicated, involving visits to notary offices, conversations with social workers, and bureaucracy that seemed endless. But Arthur didn't give up. He knew this was Daniel's chance for a better life, and he was willing to face any obstacle to ensure it happened. During this period, Daniel continued practicing religiously. With the new accordion, he discovered nuances in the music he had never noticed before. The pieces he already knew gained an impressive richness of sound, and he began exploring even more complex compositions that Arthur had saved for this advanced stage of his learning. Mrs. Eleanor became a sort of unofficial agent for Daniel. She told everyone in town about the boy's extraordinary talent, and soon small crowds began gathering in the house's garden on afternoons when Daniel practiced. One of these afternoons was particularly special. Patricia, Arthur's daughter, had finally accepted her father's invitation to meet Daniel and Mrs. Eleanor. She arrived nervous, clearly still carrying prejudices, but curious about the boy who had caused so much change in her father's life. Daniel was practicing in the garden when Patricia arrived. She stood at the entrance listening to the music coming from the accordion, and for the first time understood what her father had tried to explain about the boy's talent. "My God," she murmured to Arthur. "He really plays like that?" "This is one of his simpler performances," Arthur replied with pride. When Daniel finished playing, Arthur called him over to introduce him to his daughter. "Daniel, this is Patricia, my daughter." Daniel approached politely, extending his hand. "Very nice to meet you, Mrs. Patricia." Patricia shook the boy's hand and was surprised by his manners and kindness. He was nothing like what she had imagined when thinking of a street kid. "The pleasure is mine, Daniel. My father has told me a lot about you." "Good things, I hope," Daniel smiled. The innocence of his smile and the humility in his response touched Patricia in a way she hadn't expected. She spent the rest of the afternoon watching Daniel interact with her father and Mrs. Eleanor, seeing the genuine joy the boy brought to the lives of the two elderly people. When preparing to leave, Patricia called her father aside. "Dad, I need to apologize. I was completely wrong about Daniel. He's really special, isn't he?" "Yes, he is, my daughter, in every way." "And are you happy here? Truly happy?" Arthur looked around, seeing Mrs. Eleanor helping Daniel put away the accordion, hearing their laughter echoing through the garden. "Happier than I've been in years, Patricia. I've found a purpose again." Patricia nodded, finally understanding her father's decision. Can I come back other times? I'd like to get to know Daniel better before he goes to the capital." "Of course. He would be very happy. And so would I." In the following days, Patricia became a regular visitor at Mrs. Eleanor's house. She brought books for Daniel, helped him with some basic math and Portuguese lessons that would be important at his new school, and they gradually became friends. Daniel, who had never had a young female figure in his life, was fascinated by the stories Patricia told about her work as an accountant. She, in turn, rediscovered the pleasure of teaching and caring for someone. "Patricia," Daniel said one afternoon, "why did you never have children? You would have been a very cool mum." The question caught Patricia off guard. She became thoughtful for a moment before answering. "You know, Daniel, sometimes life doesn't happen as we plan. I was so focused on work, so worried about small problems, that I forgot to pay attention to the things that are truly important." "Like what?" "Like family, like helping other people, like you do with your music. You play and people become happy. That is a very special gift." "You have special gifts too," Daniel said seriously. "You are very smart and kind. I'm sure you make many people happy in your work." The boy's words made Patricia reflect on her life in a way she hadn't done in a long time. Perhaps there was still time to find more purpose and joy in her daily life. 2 weeks before the scheduled date for Daniel to go to the capital, news arrived that would change all the plans. Maestro Richard called to inform that an even better opportunity had come up. An internationally renowned music school was offering special scholarships for exceptional young talents, and Daniel had been nominated to compete for one of these spots. "Arthur," Maestro Richard said over the phone, "this is a unique opportunity. If Daniel gets this scholarship, he will not only have access to the best teachers in the country, but also the possibility of studying abroad when he is older." The news was exciting, but it also brought a complication. Daniel would have to participate in a special audition in the capital, competing with other young musicians from all over the country. The pressure would be much greater than anything he had ever faced before. When Arthur told the news to Daniel and Mrs. Eleanor, the reactions were mixed. Daniel was obviously nervous about the prospect of competing with more experienced musicians, but also excited about the possibility of an even better opportunity. "Professor, do you think I have a real chance of getting this scholarship?" asked Daniel, his voice betraying his anxiety. "Daniel, your talent is unique. I'm sure the evaluators will recognize that. But you need to prepare very well for this audition. It will be different from anything you've done before." Mrs. Eleanor, always practical, soon began to worry about the logistical details. "Arthur, Who will accompany the boy to the capital? He can't go alone. I'm going with him, of course. We'll stay there a few days so he can get familiar with the environment before the audition. And if he doesn't get the scholarship? Asked Mrs. Eleanor, voicing the fear everyone was feeling but no one wanted to express. Then he goes to the first school as originally planned, Arthur replied firmly. Either way, he will have a quality music education. In the following 2 weeks, the preparation for the audition intensified dramatically. Arthur created a rigorous study program focused not only on technique but also on performance under pressure. He knew that Daniel would be evaluated not only for his musical skill but also for his ability to perform confidently before an examination board. Daniel dedicated himself to his studies with impressive determination. He woke up early to practice before Mrs. Eleanor got up, spent the morning studying music theory with Arthur, and devoted entire afternoons to the accordion. Patricia started visiting every day, bringing materials she thought might be useful and offering emotional support. She had become a kind of older sister to Daniel, and her constant presence helped ease the boy's anxiety. "Daniel, have you thought about what you're going to play at the audition?" she asked one afternoon. "Professor Arthur said I have to prepare 3 pieces, 1 technical, 1 expressive, and 1 free choice. For the technical one, I'll play a Czerny study adapted for accordion. For the expressive one, a Brazilian ballad. And for the free choice, the Waltz of Lost Winds," Patricia completed. Daniel nodded. "It's risky because it's very difficult, but it was the song that changed my life. It was through it that I met your father." "Then it's the right choice," Patricia said with conviction. "You play that waltz like no one else." The week of the trip to the capital arrived quickly. Arthur had managed to get bus tickets and reserved a simple room in a boarding house near the school where the audition would be held. Mrs. Eleanor prepared a suitcase with suitable clothes for Daniel, including a suit that she had specially tailored for the occasion. On the night before the trip, the 4 of them, Arthur, Daniel, Mrs. Eleanor, and Patricia, gathered in the living room for a special farewell dinner. Mrs. Eleanor had prepared Daniel's favorite dishes, and Patricia brought a cake she had made especially for the occasion. "Daniel," Mrs. Eleanor said during dessert, "I want you to know that regardless of the audition result, I am very proud of you. You brought joy and music back into my life. And you gave a new purpose to mine too," Arthur added. Patricia hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Daniel, you taught me that it's never too late to change, to find important things in life. Thank you for that." Daniel felt his eyes fill with tears. Those 3 people had become his family in a way he never thought possible. The gratitude he felt was so intense he could barely speak. "You saved my life," he finally said, his voice choked. "I don't know how I can thank you for everything you've done for me." "You already have, my boy," Arthur said. "You thanked us every time you played from the heart, every time you pushed yourself to learn, every time you showed that our trust in you was justified." That night, Daniel had trouble sleeping. He lay awake thinking about the audition, the possibilities opening up before him, and also the loved ones he was leaving behind. It was a mix of excitement and melancholy that kept him awake until late. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The bus trip to the capital lasted 6 hours. Daniel spent most of the time looking out the window, watching the landscape gradually change from small country towns to suburbs, and finally to the tall buildings of the metropolis. It was his first time leaving his hometown, and everything seemed both exciting and frightening. Arthur discreetly watched the boy, sensing his mix of anxiety and curiosity. He himself was nervous, but tried to maintain a calm appearance so as not to negatively influence Daniel. "How are you feeling?" he asked as they got closer to the capital. "Nervous," Daniel admitted. "What if I don't make it? What if the other candidates are much better than me?" "Daniel, you're not just competing against other musicians. You're demonstrating a unique talent that can't be compared to anything. Remember, you learned to play the Waltz of Lost Winds on your own when you didn't even know it was considered impossible. But what if they don't like my style? What if they think I play differently because I'm self-taught?" Arthur put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Daniel, the fact that you taught yourself is exactly what makes your talent so special. You developed a unique approach, a musical sensitivity that can't be taught. This is a gift, not a flaw. When they arrived in the capital, Daniel was amazed by the busy streets, the noise of traffic, the number of people. It was a world completely different from what he knew. Arthur guided him through the bus station to the boarding house where they would stay. The boarding house was simple but clean, located on a quiet street just a few blocks from the music school. The room had 2 narrow beds, a small table, and a window that looked out onto an inner courtyard. It wasn't luxurious, but it served their purposes perfectly. "Let's rest this afternoon," said Arthur after they had settled in. "Tomorrow morning we'll visit the school and you can get familiar with the environment before the audition." On that first night in the capital, Daniel ate little and went to bed early, but again he had trouble falling asleep. The sounds of the big city were very different from what he was used to. Cars constantly passing, sirens in the distance, people's voices in the streets. But gradually, he got used to the urban noise and managed to fall asleep. The next morning, after a simple breakfast at the boarding house, Arthur and Daniel walked to the music school. It was an imposing building, constructed in the early 20th century, with architecture that blended classical and Art Nouveau elements. The hallways were wide with high ceilings, and the rooms had a special acoustics that enhanced any musical sound. Daniel was impressed by the number of different instruments he saw in the hallways: grand pianos, antique violins, various types of flutes, and many others he couldn't even identify. It was like entering a universe where music wasn't just a hobby or a way to earn a few coins, but the center of everything. "Daniel," said Arthur as they walked through the halls, "I want you to observe everything, but don't be intimidated. Remember, you belong here as much as anyone else." They met the secretary in charge of audition registrations, a middle-aged woman named Deborah, who greeted them warmly. "So you're Daniel Miller," she said, consulting a list. "I've heard very positive comments about your talent. Maestro Richard spoke wonders of your performance." Daniel thanked her politely, but Arthur noticed the boy was getting more and more nervous as the reality of the situation became more concrete. "Deborah," asked Arthur, "would it be possible for Daniel to take a look at the room where the audition will be held, just to get familiar with the environment?" "Of course. In fact, if you'd like, he can even do a small sound test. The room is free right now." The audition room was a small but elegant auditorium, with about 50 chairs arranged in semicircular rows before a modest stage. The acoustics were perfect, specifically designed for intimate musical performances. Daniel went up on stage and looked at the empty chairs. In 2 days, those chairs would be occupied by renowned teachers who would decide his future. The weight of that responsibility began to grow in his chest. "Want to try playing something?" suggested Arthur. Daniel took the accordion out of its case and adjusted it in his arms. He started with a simple scale, testing the room's acoustics. The sound spread through the space richly and envelopingly, much better than anywhere he had played before. Encouraged by the sound quality, Daniel decided to play a piece of the Waltz of Lost Winds. His notes filled the room with a beauty that made Deborah stop organizing her papers and pay attention. "My God," she murmured, "this is extraordinary." Arthur smiled, seeing that Daniel was starting to feel more comfortable in the environment. The boy played for a few minutes, exploring the acoustic possibilities of the room, and gradually his confidence returned. When they left the school, Daniel seemed more excited. "Professor, the room is beautiful, and the sound of the accordion is much better there than anywhere else. See, the environment is on your side. Now you just need to play like you know how to play." They spent the rest of the day exploring the city. Arthur wanted Daniel to see some important cultural spots, not only to broaden his horizons, but also to help him relax before the audition. They visited an art museum, walked through some central parks, and ended the day at a small restaurant where Daniel tried dishes he had never tasted before. "Professor," said Daniel during dinner, "regardless of what happens at the audition, I want you to know that these have been the best months of my life. Having a family, being able to study music, having my own room. It's more than I ever dreamed of having. Daniel, this is just the beginning. You have a bright future ahead of you, whether you get this scholarship or not." "But what if I do? Will I have to be away from you all for a long time? Arthur had thought about this question. If Daniel got the special scholarship, he would study at a boarding school during the week and only come home on weekends. It would be a significant change for everyone. If you get it, we'll find a way to make it work. The important thing is that you have the best possible opportunities to develop your talent. On the morning of the audition, Daniel woke up early, despite having slept poorly. His nerves were in tatters and he could barely eat breakfast. Arthur was equally anxious but tried to maintain a calm appearance. "Daniel, do you remember what we talked about regarding nerves?" asked Arthur as they walked to the school. "That it's normal and even helpful because it shows I care about the outcome." "Exactly. And do you remember what you should do with that nervousness? Turn it into energy for the music." When they arrived at the school, there were other young candidates with their families or teachers. Daniel discreetly observed his competitors. Some seemed much more experienced, carrying expensive instruments and talking confidently about advanced musical techniques. "Don't compare yourself to others," murmured Arthur. "Everyone has their own musical journey." An assistant called all the candidates for an informational meeting. Daniel found out he would be 8th on a list of 12 candidates, and each would have exactly 20 minutes for their presentation. The auditions started at 9 in the morning. Daniel and Arthur sat in a waiting room where they could faintly hear the music coming from the auditorium. Some candidates played impressive technical pieces, others focused more on expressiveness. Everyone seemed very competent. As the morning passed, Daniel grew increasingly nervous. His hands began to sweat, and he felt his heart racing. Arthur tried to keep him distracted with conversations on various topics, but he noticed the boy's anxiety was rising. "Daniel Miller!" the assistant finally called. The moment had arrived. Daniel stood up, picked up the accordion, and looked at Arthur one last time. "Remember, you belong in there as much as anyone. Play from the heart, like you always do." Daniel nodded, took a deep breath, and followed the assistant to the auditorium. The judging panel consisted of 5 teachers, 3 men and 2 women, all with a serious and professional appearance. They sat at a table in front of the first rows of chairs, with papers and pens in hand to take their notes. "Good morning, Daniel," said the professor in the center, apparently the panel coordinator. "I'm Professor Henry Wilson, academic director of the school. Could you briefly introduce yourself and tell us about your musical experience?" Daniel approached the microphone on the stage. His voice came out a bit shaky at first, but gradually gained steadiness. "Good morning. My name is Daniel Miller. I'm 12 years old, and I've been playing the accordion for about 3 years. I taught myself initially, and in recent months I've been studying with Professor Arthur Thompson." "Interesting," commented one of the teachers. "You said you taught yourself? How did that happen?" Daniel briefly told his story, from the days sleeping under the music school's marquee to meeting Arthur in the square. The panel listened attentively, taking some notes. "Well, Daniel, let's hear your performance. You've prepared 3 pieces, correct?" "Yes, sir." Daniel began with the technical study by Czerny. It was a challenging piece, full of fast scales and rhythm changes that tested the performer's dexterity. Daniel played it with precision, but was still visibly nervous. Some notes came out slightly hesitant. The panel made some notes, but their expressions revealed nothing about their impressions. Next, Daniel played the American ballad he had prepared. It was a more expressive piece that allowed for greater personal interpretation. Here Daniel began to relax a bit, and his true musicality started to show. The melody flowed more naturally, and he managed to add some emotional nuances to the performance. The panel seemed more interested during this second piece. Professor Henry looked up from his notes and paid more attention to the execution. "Very good," he said when Daniel finished. "And now your free choice piece." Daniel took a deep breath. It was the moment of truth. He had decided to go all in with the Waltz of Lost Winds, the music that had changed his life. "I will play the Waltz of Lost Winds by the German composer Maximilian Hoffmann." The 5 teachers exchanged glances. It was obvious they knew the piece and its reputation for extreme difficulty. "Daniel," one of the teachers said gently, "are you sure about this choice? It's an extremely complex piece, even for professional musicians." "I'm sure, ma'am." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, thought of Arthur, Mrs. Eleanor, Patricia, and all the moments he had spent playing that special waltz. When he opened his eyes, all his anxiety had turned into determination. He began to play. The first chords of the Waltz of Lost Winds filled the auditorium with a beautiful and profound melancholy. Daniel completely forgot where he was, who was listening, and what the purpose of the performance was. There was only him, the accordion, and the music. The waltz flowed like a musical river, carrying all the emotion and life experience Daniel had accumulated in his 12 years. Every note was loaded with meaning: the loneliness of the times he slept on the street, the gratitude for Mrs. Eleanor's kindness, the respect and love for Arthur, the hope for a better future. The examination panel was completely hypnotized. Professor Henry dropped his pen and leaned back in his chair, simply listening. The two female teachers exchanged glances with expressions of astonishment. It was obvious they were witnessing something extraordinary. Daniel reached the most difficult passages of the waltz, those that separate the virtuosos from the amateurs, and executed them with an ease that seemed to defy the laws of music. His small hands danced across the accordion as if they were extensions of the melody itself. When he reached the emotional climax of the piece, the auditorium was completely silent. Even the outside noises seemed to have stopped to listen to that extraordinary performance. Daniel played with such passion and technique that it was impossible not to be moved. The end of the waltz came soft and melancholic, like a tender farewell. Daniel opened his eyes and was surprised to see tears in the eyes of one of the teachers. The silence that followed lasted long seconds. Finally, Professor Henry stood up and began to applaud, followed by the other panel members. It was a respectful but clearly emotional ovation. "Daniel," said Professor Henry when the applause ceased, "in 30 years of evaluating young musicians, I have never witnessed a performance like that. Your interpretation of the Waltz of Lost Winds was simply perfect." "More than perfect," added one of the teachers. "It was inspired. You didn't just play the music, you lived it." Daniel thanked them politely, but was still in shock from the intensity of his own performance. He had given himself so completely to the music that he needed a few seconds to return to reality. "Daniel, we'll deliberate for a few minutes and call you back to communicate our decision. You can wait in the waiting room." When Daniel left the auditorium, Arthur was anxiously waiting in the hallway. One look was enough for the teacher to know that the performance had been special. "How was it?" asked Arthur. "I don't know. It was intense. I felt I played well, but I don't know if it was enough." They returned to the waiting room, where a few other candidates were still awaiting their turn. Daniel sat next to Arthur, trying to process the experience he had just lived through. 15 minutes later, which felt like hours, the assistant appeared in the waiting room. "Daniel Miller, please." Daniel and Arthur returned to the auditorium, where the panel was still gathered. Professor Henry stood up to make the announcement. "Daniel, it is with great pleasure that we inform you that you have been selected for the Special Musical Studies Scholarship. Unanimously, the panel considered your performance exceptional, demonstrating not only advanced technique, but also a rare musical sensitivity." Daniel stood still for a few seconds, processing the words. Then, slowly, a huge smile spread across his face. "Really? I made it?" "Yes, you did, young man," confirmed Professor Henry. "You will start with us next month. During the week, you will study here as a resident student and return home on weekends." Arthur was beside Daniel, his eyes brimming with pride and emotion. The entire journey from that first meeting in the square had led to this moment. "Professor Henry," said Arthur, "thank you very much for the opportunity given to Daniel. I am sure he will not disappoint." "Professor Arthur, based on what we saw today, I am certain that Daniel will become an extraordinary musician, and you played a key role in that development." In the following days, Daniel's life changed completely once again. The news of the scholarship spread quickly through his hometown. When he returned from the capital, he was welcomed as a local hero. Mrs. Martha, the turnover seller who had always treated him with affection, greeted him with an impromptu party in the square. Several townspeople gathered to hear Daniel play and to congratulate him on his achievement. "Daniel, I always knew you were special," said Mrs. Martha, hugging him with maternal care. "Since the first day you played here in the square, Mrs. Eleanor was beaming with pride. She had spent the days of the trip telling all the neighbors about Daniel's audition, and now she could announce the positive result to the whole community. "My dear boy made it," she said to anyone who would listen. "He's going to study at the best music school in the capital." Patricia was also moved by Daniel's success. In recent months, she had rediscovered the joy of caring for someone, of helping in a person's development. The idea of Daniel leaving during the week saddened her, but she knew it was best for his future. "Daniel, I'm so proud of you," she said, hugging him tightly. "You deserve every good opportunity coming your way." The month before classes started in the capital flew by quickly. Daniel continued practicing intensely, but now with a specific goal: to prepare for a much higher level of demand than he was used to. Arthur worked with him on a broader repertoire, including pieces by composers Daniel didn't even know. Besides the accordion, he began learning the basics of piano and advanced music theory, getting ready for the formal academic environment. During this period, Daniel also had to deal with complex emotional issues. On one hand, he was excited about the opportunities opening up before him. On the other, he felt melancholy about having to distance himself from the family he had found. "Professor Arthur," he said one afternoon during practice, "do you think I'll be able to adapt to the school? What if I can't keep up with the other students?" "Daniel, you've already proven you have enough talent to be there. Now it's a matter of working hard and continuing to learn. And remember, you won't be alone. I'll be following your progress, and you can always count on me." The last week at home was especially emotional. Daniel, Arthur, Mrs. Eleanor and Patricia spent a lot of time together, creating memories to sustain the coming period of separation. Mrs. Eleanor taught Daniel how to make some simple recipes that he could prepare in the school dormitory. Patricia helped him organize study materials and gave him tips on how to manage a more intense study routine. Arthur prepared a special notebook with exercises and pieces that Daniel could practice when he had free time at school. Each page had caring notes and technical advice that would help the boy when he was away from his teacher. On the eve of his departure, the four had dinner together in an atmosphere that was both festive and melancholy. It was a celebration of Daniel's success, but also a temporary farewell to the happy routine they had established. "Daniel," Mrs. Eleanor said during dessert, "I want you to promise one thing. Never forget where you came from and the people who believed in you. Success shouldn't change who you are inside." "I promise, Mrs. Eleanor. I'll never forget everything you've all done for me." "And remember," Patricia added, "this will always be your home. On weekends when you come back, we want to hear all about your classes, your classmates, your discoveries." Arthur watched Daniel throughout the conversation. The boy had changed a lot since that first night in the square. Not only had he grown physically, but he had developed a confidence and maturity that were impressive for his age. "Daniel," he finally said, "you know you've always been more than a student to me, don't you?" Daniel nodded, clearly moved. "You're like a grandfather to me, Professor. The best grandfather I could have." "Then remember, a grandfather is always proud of his grandson, regardless of victories or defeats. You've already earned my respect and my love forever." The next morning, the whole makeshift family accompanied Daniel to the bus station. This time he would travel alone, carrying 2 suitcases with his clothes, the special accordion Arthur had given him, and the notebook with music exercises. "Call as soon as you arrive," Mrs. Eleanor asked, hugging Daniel for the last time. "And don't forget to tell us everything on weekends," Patricia added. Arthur was the last to say goodbye. He hugged Daniel for a long time, whispering in his ear, "Do what you did at the audition. Play from the heart. The rest will come naturally." Daniel waved from the bus window as the vehicle pulled away from the station. His 3 guardian angels stood there, waving back, until the bus disappeared around the bend in the road. The period at the music school was indeed challenging for Daniel. The first days were especially difficult. He was used to the individual attention from Arthur and the familiar environment of Mrs. Eleanor's house. At school, he had to share the teacher's attention with other talented students and live under a strict institutional routine. His dormitory mates mostly came from middle-class families, with parents who were musicians or at least had a broader cultural background than Daniel. Initially, some showed curiosity about his past, others were indifferent, and a few displayed subtle prejudice. "Where are you from again?" asked Stephen, a 13-year-old boy who played the violin and came from a family of musicians from São Paulo. "From Lancaster in the countryside," Daniel replied. "And your parents? Are they musicians too?" The question was always difficult for Daniel. "I don't have parents. I live with a very kind lady and have a private teacher." Stephen raised his eyebrows but asked no further questions. However, Daniel noticed that the information spread quickly among the students, and some began to look at him with a mix of curiosity and pity that deeply bothered him. The classes were intense and demanding. Daniel studied the accordion with Professor Michael Peterson, a strict but fair man who soon recognized the boy's exceptional talent. Besides practical lessons, there was music theory, music history, and even basic composition classes. "Daniel," Professor Peterson said after the second week of classes, "you have an impressive natural talent, but you need to work on your theoretical foundation. You can play intuitively, but you need to understand why certain combinations work better than others." Daniel dedicated himself to his studies with the same determination he had always shown. He spent hours in the school library, studying scores and music theories that expanded his understanding of the art he loved so much. On weekends, when he returned home, Daniel would tell everything to Arthur, Mrs. Eleanor, and Patricia. His stories about life at school, his classmates, and his musical discoveries filled the house with a special energy. "How are the music theory classes going?" Arthur asked during a Sunday lunch. "Hard but fascinating," Daniel replied. "I'm learning why some songs move me so much. It's not just instinct. There are structures and patterns that provoke certain emotional reactions." Mrs. Eleanor especially enjoyed hearing about Daniel's classmates. "And that violin boy, Stephen? Did you become friends?" "Sort of. He's polite, but still a bit wary of me. I think he's never met anyone like me before." Patricia noticed that Daniel was maturing quickly. The experiences at school, interacting with people from different backgrounds, and the academic challenges were turning the boy into a thoughtful and articulate young man. "Daniel, do you miss our routine here at home?" she asked one afternoon. "I miss it a lot," Daniel admitted, "but I also know I need to be there to grow as a musician. It's strange. At the same time I want to come back home, I'm also excited to learn more at school." As the months passed, Daniel found his place at the school. His classmates began to respect him, not only for his musical talent, but also for his dedication to his studies and the humility with which he treated everyone. The decisive moment came during an internal recital, where each student was to perform a piece for the entire school. Daniel chose to play The Waltz of Lost Winds, the piece that had changed his life. When his performance ended, the auditorium erupted in applause. Students, teachers, and school staff gave a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Stephen, who had been distant from the start, was the first to congratulate him. "Daniel, that was incredible," he said, clearly impressed. "I've never heard anyone play with so much emotion." From that day on, Daniel became something of a legend at school. His classmates sought him out to play together, teachers used him as an example of dedication, and he himself gained a confidence he didn't know he had. At the end of the first year, Professor Michael called Daniel in for a special conversation. "Daniel, I need to talk about your future. Your development has been extraordinary, far beyond what we expected. There's an opportunity for you to participate in an international exchange next year." "An exchange? To where?" "To Germany. There's a school specialized in European folk music that's interested in exceptional students. You could spend 6 months there, studying the origins of the pieces you play so well, like The Waltz of Lost Winds." Daniel fell silent for a few moments, processing the information. Germany was the country where Maximilian Hoffmann, the composer of the waltz, was born. It would be a unique opportunity to understand the cultural roots of the music that had inspired him so much. "Professor, that's an incredible opportunity. But can I talk to my family first?" "Of course, it's an important decision that will affect not only you, but also the people you love." That weekend, Daniel told Arthur, Mrs. Eleanor, and Patricia about the proposal. The reaction was mixed, pride for the opportunity offered, but also worry about an even greater separation. "Daniel, what a wonderful opportunity," Arthur said immediately. "Studying in the country where the waltz was created, you could get to know the culture that inspired Maximilian Hoffman." Mrs. Eleanor was visibly concerned. "But it's so far away, my boy, and for so long." Patricia grew thoughtful. "Daniel, what do you want to do? Deep in your heart, what do you feel?" Daniel took a deep breath before answering. "I want to go. I think it's a unique chance to grow as a musician and as a person, but I'm also afraid of being away from you all for so long." "Daniel," Arthur said gently, "remember what we've always talked about. The talent you have is a gift that should be developed to the fullest. If there's an opportunity to do that in Germany, you should take it. But don't worry about us," added Mrs. Eleanor, though it was obvious the idea saddened her. "We'll be here when you return. We'll always be here." The decision was made. Daniel would accept the exchange. The next months were filled with intense preparation. Besides his regular music studies, he had to learn basic English, which would be the language of communication in Germany, study European culture, and prepare psychologically for a completely new experience. The farewell for Germany was even more emotional than his first departure for the capital. Daniel was now 15, had grown considerably, and was a much more mature young man than the boy who played in the square. But the emotional bond with his Hart family remained intense. "6 months will pass quickly," Arthur said at the airport, though he himself was visibly moved. "And you'll have so much to tell us when you return," added Patricia, fighting back tears. Mrs. Eleanor, now 75, held Daniel's hands for a long time. "My boy, you're going to discover a whole new world. Enjoy every moment, but always remember who you are and where you came from." "I'll never forget," Daniel promised. "You are my family forever." The months in Germany were transformative for Daniel. He lived in a small town near Boston, where Maximilian Hoffman had spent part of his life. The school was small, but extremely specialized, focused on preserving and teaching European folk music traditions. Daniel had the opportunity to study not only music, but the history and cultural context behind the compositions. He discovered that the Waltz of Lost Winds had been composed by Hoffman during a period of deep sadness, when he had lost his family in the war and decided to emigrate to America. "The waltz is a farewell," explained Mr. Schmidt, his German teacher. Hoffman composed it while looking at the landscapes of his homeland for the last time. Every note carries the longing of someone leaving everything behind. This revelation gave new meaning to the music that had changed Daniel's life. He began to understand why he had connected so deeply with the waltz. Like Hoffman, he too knew what it was to lose a familiar life and have to start over in a new place. During his stay in Germany, Daniel not only improved his musical technique, but developed a much deeper cultural understanding of the art he practiced. He learned about the tradition of German accordionists, about the folk festivals where music was celebrated, and about how life experiences turned into melodies. He also made friends from various nationalities. There were students from France, Italy, Poland, and even a boy from Japan who was fascinated by European folk music. This multicultural coexistence drastically expanded Daniel's worldview. "Daniel, you play as if you've lived the stories behind the music," commented Olivia, a 16-year-old Italian student who played the violin. "It's very rare to find someone so young with such musical depth." The letters and emails Daniel sent home were full of enthusiasm and discoveries. Arthur kept each message carefully, sharing the news with Mrs. Eleanor and Patricia. "Dear family," Daniel wrote in a special letter, "yesterday I visited the house where Maximilian Hoffman lived before coming to America. I played the Waltz of Lost Winds on the piano where he composed it. It was an indescribable experience, as if I were conversing with the spirit of the composer. I understood that our music is not just notes and rhythms, but living history, emotion transformed into art." When Daniel returned from Germany, he was visibly different. He was 16 years old, had grown a few more inches, and carried a cultural maturity that impressed everyone. But what moved his family the most was realizing that despite all the experiences and opportunities, he remained the same caring and humble person they had raised. "I missed you all so much," he said, at the first dinner at home. "All the wonderful experiences I had only made sense because I knew I would return to tell you about them." The following years were ones of consolidation for Daniel. He finished his studies at the capital's music school, always as one of the top students. He won several music competitions, received offers to study at renowned universities, and gradually became known in musical circles as one of the country's most promising young talents. Arthur, now in his 70s, followed each of Daniel's achievements with paternal pride. Mrs. Eleanor, despite her advanced age, never missed a recital or performance by the boy who had become her grandson in heart. Patricia had found a new purpose in life, working as a volunteer administrator of the small music school that Arthur had opened at home. "Professor," said Daniel one afternoon, when he was already 18 and preparing to enter university, "have you ever stopped to think about how our lives have changed since that day in the square?" Arthur looked around the room where he taught several young people from the region. The small school had grown and now served more than 30 children and teenagers. Some had exceptional talent, others just wanted to learn for pleasure, but all were welcomed with the same affection and dedication. "It changed for all of us, Daniel. You brought music back into my life, purpose to Mrs. Eleanor's days and meaning to Patricia's care. But more than that, you showed that a chance encounter can transform many lives." "It wasn't chance," Daniel replied seriously. "It was destiny. It was written that we would meet." Daniel decided to study music at the Federal University in the capital, specializing in folk instruments and music education. His idea was to become not only a professional musician, but also an educator, following Arthur's example. During university, he kept the routine of returning home on weekends, but now not just as the young man who came back to visit his family. He had become a teaching assistant at Arthur's school, helping with beginner students and bringing new techniques he learned at university. "Daniel," Arthur said one morning, "I think it's time for you to take on more responsibilities here at the school. I'm getting old, and you already know more about music teaching than I do." "Professor, you'll never be too old for music, and I'll never know more than you. You taught me not just technique, but what really matters, how music can transform lives." It was during his final year of university that Daniel received an offer that would once again change the course of his life. A scholarship to pursue a master's degree in musicology in Germany, specifically studying the work of Maximilian Hoffmann and other composers who immigrated to America. "It's an opportunity to complete the cycle," Daniel explained to his family. "I can study in depth the work of the composer who changed our lives and then come back to teach that story to others." This time the separation would be longer, 2 years. But everyone understood that it was a unique opportunity for Daniel to become not just an excellent musician, but an expert in a very specific and important area. "Go, my boy," said Mrs. Eleanor, now 80 years old but still lucid and caring. "You have a mission, to study, learn, and then come back to share that knowledge with the world." During his master's degree in Germany, Daniel developed a thesis on the influence of German folk music on American cultural formation, the case of Maximilian Hoffmann. His research revealed not only fascinating details about the composer's life, but also how European immigration had influenced American popular music in ways few had studied before. Daniel not only studied German music theory, but traveled through several regions of the country, documenting folk traditions that were being lost. He created an impressive musical archive, recording elderly musicians who were the last to know certain traditions. "I'm doing for German folklore what someone should have done for the music I learned on the streets of America," he wrote in a letter to Arthur. "I'm preserving stories that could be lost forever." When Daniel returned from his master's degree, he brought with him not just a diploma, but an ambitious project to create a center for the preservation and teaching of folk music in America, documenting both American traditions and the European influences on the country's musical formation. "Daniel," Arthur said when he heard about the project, "this is bigger than both of us. But if there's anyone who can make this happen, that someone is you." The project took 5 years to materialize. Daniel worked tirelessly, writing proposals, seeking funding, connecting with universities and cultural institutes. Arthur and Mrs. Eleanor supported him at every step, even when the project seemed impossible. Patricia, who had married at 50 to a professor at the local university, used her administrative experience to help Daniel with the bureaucratic part of the project. The family that had formed by chance in Mrs. Eleanor's house now worked together on a common mission. The Maximilian Hoffman Folk Music Center was inaugurated when Daniel was 28 years old. It was a small but well-structured institution that offered folk music courses, maintained an archive of historical recordings, and promoted research on cultural influences in American music. Arthur, now 78 years old, was the honorary opening professor. Mrs. Eleanor, 85 years old, and using a wheelchair, cut the inaugural ribbon. Patricia took over the administration of the center. "You see, Daniel," said Arthur during the inauguration ceremony, "that music you played in the square at 12 years old transformed not only your life, but created something that will benefit thousands of people." Daniel, now a mature man and respected musician, looked at the people gathered at the inauguration. There were students, teachers, professional musicians, and also ordinary people from the community who had become interested in the center's proposal. "Professor," he said, "none of this would have happened if you hadn't stopped that afternoon to listen to me play." A moment of curiosity turned into a lifetime of music and purpose. "Daniel, you're mistaken. I'm the one who should thank you. You brought back the passion I had lost over the years. You reminded me why I chose to be a music teacher." The center quickly became a success. Young musicians came from various parts of the country to study there. International researchers visited the archive to consult the recordings Daniel had collected. And most importantly, children from the local community had free access to quality music lessons. Daniel never forgot his origins. Once a month he played in the same square where it all began, now no longer to collect coins, but to remind the community that music is a heritage for everyone. During these monthly performances, there was always a crowd. Daniel played several pieces, but he always ended with the Waltz of Lost Winds. It was his way of honoring the music that had changed his life and the lives of everyone around him. "Daniel," said an elderly lady after one of these performances, "my little grandson wants to learn music. Do you think he has talent?" Daniel smiled, remembering a similar question Arthur had faced years ago. "Ma'am, every child has talent. The important thing is to give that talent the opportunity to flourish." At 35 years old, Daniel was nationally recognized as one of the country's greatest experts in folk music. He had written 3 books, recorded 4 albums, and mentored dozens of graduate students. But his greatest achievement remained the center that bore Maximilian Hoffman's name. Arthur had passed away at 82 years old, sleeping peacefully on a Sunday afternoon, after a full and meaningful life. Daniel was by his side in his final days, playing the professor's favorite songs and reminiscing about all the special moments they had shared. "Daniel," were some of Arthur's last words, "keep teaching music. But most importantly, keep showing people that a chance encounter can change a life forever." Mrs. Eleanor lived to be 90 years old, always lucid and interested in everything that happened at the music center. Daniel visited her daily, playing for her every afternoon. She passed away while listening to Daniel play the Waltz of Lost Winds, with a peaceful smile on her face. Patricia continued managing the center, but also became a music educator in her own right. At 60, she began teaching senior citizens, proving it's never too late to learn music. Daniel married at 40 to Sarah, a musicologist he had met during an international conference. They had 2 children, Arthur, named after the teacher who had changed his father's life, and Eleanor, named after the woman who had been his first grandmother of the heart. Little Arthur and little Eleanor grew up in the music center, surrounded by music from the cradle. By age 10, young Arthur was already playing guitar with impressive skill. Eleanor became more interested in theoretical studies and began showing talent for composition. "Daddy," little Arthur asked one afternoon, "can you teach me to play that song that changed your life?" Daniel looked at his son and smiled. It was time to pass on not just the technique of the Waltz of Lost Winds, but the entire story behind it. "Of course, my son. But first I'll tell you the story of a boy who had nothing but an old accordion and a dream in his heart." And so Daniel began telling his children the same story you have just heard. The story of how a chance encounter in a dusty square turned into a lifetime of music, family, and purpose. The music center continued growing. When Daniel turned 50, the institution was already serving over 1,000 students per year, maintained one of the largest folk music archives in the country, and had become an international reference in cultural preservation. Daniel never stopped playing the Waltz of Lost Winds. It was his way of keeping the memory of Arthur and Mrs. Eleanor alive, and of reminding everyone that sometimes the most important changes in our lives begin with the simplest gestures. At the entrance of the music center, there's a plaque Daniel commissioned in honor of the people who changed his life. In memory of Professor Arthur Thompson and Mrs. Eleanor Roberts, who proved that family doesn't need to share blood, just love and music. And in honor of all educators who believe every child deserves an opportunity. Every time Daniel read that plaque, he remembered that afternoon in the square when a well-dressed man in a Panama hat challenged him to play an impossible song. He didn't know at that moment that he was about to find not just a teacher, but an entire family that would completely change the course of his life. Music continued to be the common thread through everything. At the center's concerts, Daniel always reserved a special moment to play alone, just him and his accordion, the songs that had shaped his journey. In those moments, he could swear he felt Arthur and Mrs. Eleanor's presence applauding in the audience. Music isn't just art, Daniel often told his students. It's a bridge between people, a path to finding family where we least expect it, and a way to transform any suffering into beauty. And so, the story that began with a homeless boy playing accordion to earn a few coins turned into a legend about the transformative power of music and human kindness. Daniel proved that it doesn't matter where we start in life, but rather how we choose to use the talents and opportunities we find along the way. Every child who learned music at the center carried with them not just musical technique, but the most important lesson of all, that we should never give up on our dreams, and that we should always be willing to help someone who needs an opportunity. The Waltz of Lost Winds continued to be played in the town square every time Daniel performed there, and whenever the music echoed through the air, people remembered that sometimes the most beautiful miracles begin with the simplest encounters. End of story. And now tell me what you thought of this moving story. Do you believe Daniel made the right decisions in accepting the challenges that appeared in his life? Which moment touched your heart the most? Leave your honest opinion in the comments. I love hearing what you all think. Thank you so much for joining me on this musical journey full of emotion. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.